Okay, so in part two of this week's material, we're talking about basically the housing market and the very well recognized problem of how young people are largely priced out of it. Just get the slide to move. So it's kind of a well-worn cliche meme stereotype now about the whole avocado thing. And it's not just in Australia, it's actually taken off in the UK and the US as well. It's become a bit of a meme over there. And it kind of did start in Australia where Bernard Salt, so-called business advisor, kind of basically, years ago now, probably only 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, was talking about how if, young people just need to save more and be more disciplined and all this kind of stuff and eat less avocados and toast at hipster cafes, I'll be able to afford a house. Very quickly, it was pointed out how absurd that is. And I won't go into the math there, but it's just a stupid thing to say. But like, this is essentially many stupid things are said about young people in public that has very little relation to their economic circumstances. Again, it relates back to that generational stuff where it seems to be inevitable as people get older, they start ragging on younger people for all kinds of issues, all kinds of reasons. But again, we've already gone over that. But like the figure of youth here is that kind of irresponsible. They just need to kind of, make the right choices, be more frugal, delay gratification and all that kind of stuff. So I think, when you see something written as stark as this, it kind of makes all those claims completely absurd. I mean, the average wage in the last, 21 years has gone up just under triple, but the average housing costs in places like Sydney for a median unit have gone up, 6 or 7 times. And since 2001, it's probably well over $1 million now, I think.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
it's gone up a lot more than that now,
definitely.
and the average wage wouldn't have risen much up over 70 anyway. So, and it's not, and that's a constant relation. And the other thing you hear a lot about is, back in the 80s and 90s, interest rates were 17%, and people were certainly doing it hard back then. But like again, the actual economic circumstances at the moment in terms of relation of wages to mortgages, people are doing it actually as tough or tougher now with the 7% kind of
Yeah,
interest rate. So that's the lay of the land, right?
yeah.
So what we want to talk about here is like how all that kind of comes around. So what comes about and home ownership has been a kind of central part of the great Australian dream, hasn't it?
It has, yes. So, when you think about what is a good life in Australia and what does, progress to adulthood look like as well. So I think it's very linked to being a fully fledged adult. Because generally, you leave home, you start full-time work, you buy a house, get married, have children. Like that is the kind of
Yeah.
linear life course. And so, being unable to do that or pushing that back further can give young people the sense that they're not, becoming fully fledged adults until a later age or are never, hitting that milestone.
Yeah. So, that's something I kind of spoke about in the earlier lectures. It's like youth studies' own findings is kind of actually challenging the very definition of youth because those markers of adulthood are happening later and later and later, sometimes if at all. So
Yep.
it's definitely too in terms of Australian culture that the kind of quarter acre block and kind of the backyard cricket and all that kind of stuff has been key to kind of understanding what Australia is and having backyard Barbies and having that security. As you mentioned before, our whole retirement kind of lifestyle is based on owning your own house. And that's a little bit different in places like Europe and stuff like that as
Oh,
well.
definitely. So in Australia, we kind of post World War II had a boom in home ownership. We had really high rates of owner occupied housing, some of the highest in the world. And so if that is kind of set as our standard of what to expect, because that's our parents' generation, or for some of you now, I think grandparents' generation, this post World War II generation who had really high rates of home ownership. But I think what gets lost in this conversation is that there were also enormous amounts of houses being built at this time, and there were government schemes to help people essentially rent to buy. So there were different pathways into home ownership. And as we saw, property kind of relative to average income, the ratio was just not as high. So it
Yeah.
was more feasible for even a family on a single income.
Yeah. So another thing that happened in terms of the housing market as well is that housing is kind of almost by cultural understanding has moved from a dwelling to an investment.
Yeah.
Financial kind of orientations are much more important to think about housing now, even if you just have the one and you're living in one. Like it's about setting yourself up for the future, possibly selling it in the future and buying a small place to see change or get an apartment or move into a village or whatever. So there's been a key change there. There's also been kind of broader pop culture, like, um, like renovation shows and decoration shows and the block and all this kind of stuff. Like housing itself has become something that's kind of key to much of this culture. And the media itself is just constantly reporting on this stuff.
Definitely,
And
yes.
there's no coincidence, Sydney Morning Herald owns the domain site. So there's a kind of, mutual kind of benefit from that going on. So culturally, housing worries, housing kind of status and all that kind of stuff have become much more important. Status has always been connected to housing. And the quote there from Humphrey McQueen kind of bears that out. But it's become very much central to like Australia's economy, investment, and the way that we think about the future and adulthood in our lives.
Definitely, yes.
So what's some of the research say about this kind of stuff? The reading in this part this week is the Arundel and Ronald paper.
Yeah, fantastic. So we can see in this particular reading and just in general that across these, homeowner societies, these societies with historically, post-World War II, high rates of owner-occupied housing, the US, the UK, and Australia, they all show declining access to home ownership, particularly concentrated amongst younger generations. So those who are being more and more affected by the rising prices. They show that there's, again, growing inequalities in who owns housing. So more and more people own, multiple dwellings while others own no housing. So there's a kind of concentration effect, and there's in some contexts also volatility in pricing, not so much in Australia because we have such kind of tightly held housing markets, but just in general, in terms of how things have gone in Australia. So housing has turned into an asset essentially, rather than a dwelling. So we think of housing, as Steve said, we think of it as a financial asset rather than a home, rather than a functional place that we live and we're with our family. And that's part of a wider process that we can call financialization, where kind of the logic of assets and financial markets kind of creep into more and more domains of life, including our private lives. And we can see that housing is treated as an asset and is such a good kind of asset in so many ways. It's not by mistake or coincidence. It's due to the tax settings that we have here in Australia. So we have settings where there's a kind of a discount on capital gains tax. We have the ability to negatively gear properties and reduce the amount of income tax that you're paying. So there's ways to essentially use a house to gain wealth in a way that's not really as possible even with income from employment.
Yeah, and like in terms of the whole kind of sociology project of making it all look strange, I would call that middle class welfare. Like there's a bunch of kind of structural taxation and policy things that kind of fundamentally favour those with property over those that don't, and we don't really think of that as welfare. We think of people that know, that need to get a job or whatever, having to kind of support themselves and going to the dole office to get money as welfare. But like for me, that's a really good example of middle class welfare, where a taxation and policy system set up to advantage people that are already advantaged. So I think that's a kind of really good way to think about the problems of this structurally, that there's not only inequalities in terms of who owns what and who lives where and that kind of thing, and it's growing, but the mechanisms we have that control this kind of market are actually lubricating that process.
That is really true. Yes, I think middle class welfare is a fantastic way to think about it. Because if we compare, the kind of tax rates for wages earned from work, we have a progressive tax system, so you're taxed more and more the more that you earn, whereas the kind of income gained from housing, so capital gains, the kind of value of the property that is increased after selling it, that's taxed in a flat way. So if your properties were 4 million or 1 million, same tax rate. So obviously higher amount, but same rate of tax, same tax bracket.
Yeah.
So the kind of progressive nature of our taxation system, it's only for part of our taxation system. It is not for housing. And I think that is really interesting.
Yeah. And it kind of makes sense in a way when housing was as much an investment for that to happen, but now the kind of sheer amounts of dollars here and the fact that less people own more and more of them is actually now a kind of real twist in kind of terms of what that policy is meant to do. So there's a lot of interesting work around this kind of structurally, particularly in relation to class. And in Australia, Atkins, Cooper and Connings have spoken about a new way of thinking about class and the asset economy. And what they're talking about here is that where we've largely sketched out a class system that's kind of relative to occupations, they're arguing today that while that still kind of works in some respects, we need to kind of map on who owns houses and who doesn't now. So, for instance, people like us, if you're an academic just starting, and you're an academic with a house and you're not in the same job, but you're much more likely to be more structurally secure if you have that mortgage to someone coming in now. The reason they kind of see this as important too is that the average wage in Australia, I think what it said back there was $70,000. But if you own $1 million house, it's probably going up $70,000 a year or something, right, in terms of its value these days. So the appreciation of your home is actually now more than a year's wage.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's the dynamic that property as an asset now, in many cases, especially in the Sydney market, it earns more than your average worker. So the existing schemas that we had of social class that didn't include assets, they obviously are due for some kind of adjustment. And so the Adkins, Cooper and Koenig here focus primarily or exclusively on asset ownership, particularly housing, and they only really look at wages in so much as they are used to service debts such as mortgage debts. So we can debate the kind of accuracy or utility of this schema. I would say that occupation still matters, but definitely we need to include home ownership and proximity to assets as well as part of this. So just to foreshadow some of what I'm going to be talking about in the next section, the significance of home ownership is not just for the people that are on the deed, on the title. It's also for the people around them. So if your parents are homeowners, you are able to, they can use that property to guarantee a loan. They can withdraw equity from that property to provide assistance in a way that parents who don't own property are not able to. So in terms of kind of life chances, there's also a proximity effect going on here that's really interesting.
Yep. So tell us a little bit about the family assistance to home ownership stuff.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. So in a dynamic that, it's probably something that you could see coming a mile off, the price pressures in the property market, the fact that property is becoming more and more expensive. We've been having reports of an increase in rate of first home buyers in Australia having direct financial assistance from members of their family, most commonly their parents. And so in mid 2021, that was estimated to be about 60% of first home buyers receiving at least some financial assistance. And just for kind of contrast, that's up from about 5% in 2010. So it's something that has kind of skyrocketed as the
incredible.
It is. Yeah. It's changed enormously. So we can critique the methodology of this particular study a little bit, but it gives us an indication that this is a really kind of sharply growing issue. And so in kind of alignment with that, we've had more and more research coming out that's looked at the role of asset ownership and proximity to assets in shaping life chances. It's a booming area of sociology because it's it's something that's more and more coming into play in terms of shaping who has what, who can do what. It's a really important kind of axis of inequality. And there's also emerging research looking at the impact of these dynamics of this kind of form of assistance on family relationships. So that includes my own research. So, you can imagine if you're receiving significant sums of money from relatives that, that doesn't come without strings attached. As Marcel Mauss would say, a gift is never just a gift.
Yep.
There's always something that comes along with it, even if it's assumptions about the type of house you buy, assumptions about the type of life you're going to lead. And so there's some interesting work about as well, how notions of kind of meritocracy are navigated in these circumstances, how people reconcile, their ideas about themselves as independent people with, being recipients of large amounts of essentially, unearned wealth. And so the question that I'm interested in, that my research kind of pursues, is how do young people imagine secure lives in this particular context? Like, how are they, building lives and futures where they're combating some of that pervasive uncertainty?
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting to think about the idea of meritocracy here, which we've already looked at in the course around education. I mean, again, two young people that are kind of doing the same degree, going into the same job. One's obviously going to struggle more to buy a house unless they already have kind of wealth and help and all that kind of stuff. So the idea of kind of just making the right choices, eating the less avocados and being able to buy a house or whatever is just fundamentally kind of shown as bunk when we kind of think about these kind of structural constraints.
Definitely, yes.
Yep. So I think to sum up this section, you tell us a little bit about what this means more broadly for kind of this idea of financialized subjectivity.
Yeah, so in my research, I've looked at I suppose how these new dynamics are, how they're viewing housing as an asset rather than a dwelling, receiving money from parents as a way to buy housing, you know, and the kind of, I suppose, dynamics that emerge around that. I've looked at how that impacts upon our kind of subjectivities and the ways that we think about ourselves and act in the world. And so I focused on work on the financialization of everyday life, trying to figure out how are people kind of inculcated into, I suppose, into certain like views and dispositions based on their interactions with the property market. And I've posed the question, how are financialized logics and the conditioning of financialized subjectivities kind of enacted within and through families? So we often think about families as somewhere that's kind of separate from finances, separate from the world of finances and assets, as something that is outside of money. When you talk to people about family and money, they will always say money shouldn't change things. And while they may say that, demonstrably it does. It really does. And we learn about money from our families. We absorb lessons about finances, about what one should do. And so I'm interested in how this new context, where we're dealing with kind of assets and housing and all of those things, how does that impact upon family relationships, but also what does that mean for individuals? What kind of subjectivity has come about through going through this process of essentially being kind of coached to buy a house by their parents? And so I think that's what I'm going to be talking to you about next.
Excellent. Thanks.